Welcome to Terror in Tandem, a podcast about finding entertainment in the macabre, hosted by the knowledgeable and lovable Laura and Richard Mathiasen. Each episode, we discuss the horror genre, from books to film to TV and beyond, sometimes even from the beyond. You can find us online at terrorintandem.com or on Instagram at Terror in Tandem. You can also find us on YouTube now, Terror in Tandem.
Yeah, check out our channel. It's blowing up.
It sure is. It's exploding. It blew the tube out of the U.
It did.
It'll blow you out of the tube.
It's set up pretty nicely. It's got a playlist for each year we've been on the air. It's got separate playlists for our now legendary, beloved Oktoberfest. Yeah, so you can hop in, take a listen. But we do love our subscribers and downloaders on podcast apps such as Spotify, Apple, and whatever else hasn't been conglomerated and taken over and mashed into one big glob of a corporation.
Shout out to our YouTube family.
Yeah, what's up, YouTube family? Hopefully the algorithm has led you to us.
Yeah.
A happy, weird place to be that is not problematic.
And just as a reminder, tell your friends, tell influencers, tell people to give us a listen, a like, and
tell your mortal enemies.
Yeah, and we'll take anybody.
Yeah, tell your nemesis.
I just think it's important that if you want us to keep giving you content, we're doing this out of the kindness of our heart.
You hear
and
that,
we
Gabriel?
have 17 mortgages.
Well, yeah, listen, those luxury properties.
Did I say mortgages?
Well, that's the special secret rich person mortgage.
No, that's the horror mortgage.
The mortgage?
It's like mortuary.
Yeah.
A mortgage on a mortuary.
I think this whole section is itself a horror show.
Yeah.
I love making new portmanteaus. That's why I like the German language. Whenever they want to invent a new word, they just take like 5 or 6 existing words and mash them into like a 16-syllable word, like Geschwindigkeitsmagen, and it means a very, very specific thing. That's just a versatile. Like the IKEA of languages. You can just keep adding to it like a modular, like Legos. It's a Lego language. Is this offensive?
Probably.
Well, I feel like it's Germany. You can still make fun of Germany. And I'm not making fun. I love Germany. I do love Germany. I've been there. It's such a lovely place.
This is off tangent.
Anyway.
So let's talk about what we are going to talk about.
Let's go to Terror on Tangent.
Yeah, I feel like that's sort of how this podcast started. I needed you to have a repository for your ramblings.
We actually don't even publish these. Laura just tells me that they're being published, but it's just it's cheaper than therapy.
So we're going to upstart our newest deep dive into a famous horror creator. Writer. Literary, yeah. Literally and literarily.
Yes, we want to remind our audience that both of our
read more than just
hosts
Stephen King.
Read books, and yes, it's not just all Stephen King. Although
if that was,
it's a lot of Stephen King.
If they were like
Desert Island, one author.
Yeah, one author.
Pick Stephen King. You've got like 900 books to read,
and all
it's
different
great.
kinds.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to pick David Foster Wallace. Oh. He wrote like 1 or 2 books, but they were really long.
I don't think
that
Stephen King wrote anything about being on a deserted island, so it's
coming
not like you would
at
have
you
those horrors.
In 3 weeks. He just needs to get started right now, and I'd say by the end of the day, he can have a first draft done.
But contrary to the last 30 seconds, this episode isn't
No,
be
actually,
about
we are
going
to go back a little bit further. We're going to talk about one of Stephen King's greatest influences, one of the granddaddies of modern horror, a man whose short life on this earth and relatively small body of work has permeated nearly every horror tale, especially Western style, that has come out since. There is no modern horror without the man we're going to discuss. And yes, of course, we are talking about
Edgar Allan Poe.
Edgar Allan Poe.
The original Poe.
The original weirdo.
The man, the myth, and the legend of death.
Yeah, died
Many
young.
Deaths.
Like I said, had a relatively small body of work, especially compared to the aforementioned Stephen King. But 150 years later, 170 years later, we are still obsessed.
Yeah.
And for good reason.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is we are going to roll these episodes out, as we did with our previously aforementioned deep dive.
Yeah.
Every few months.
I don't think this will be as many parts as the last one. What do you think?
It's going to be as many parts as it's going to be. We're going to talk about his horror writing. We're going to deep dive into some specific stories. And then we're going to talk, have an episode or so about his adaptations.
Yeah, exactly.
We may do like a best of Poe adaptations and a not best of adaptations.
I am very much looking forward to that because
we get to talk about.
I get to talk a lot about
the Fall of the House of Usher.
Yes, we do, and I also get to talk a lot about Vincent Price.
Yes,
because Vincent Price and Roger Corman made, to date, the greatest Poe adaptations of all time.
And we're just gonna call them potations.
Yeah, I don't.
When we quote Edgar Allan Poe, they're also.
You can't see this, listener, but she's doing air quotes right now. So this first installment into the deep dive it's a little bit different than the rest of them are going to be.
Yeah, we're just going to lay out our why, why of it.
And we're going to get a little personal with it, too.
And a little bit of the who. Yeah. Who and why.
I feel like we did the who.
No.
Oh, more of yes,
like
yes.
A
more complete picture than just the name.
We're going to give you a little bit of a background on Poe himself. And again, I think I mentioned the mysteries around his death, which is extremely interesting to me.
Very interesting.
I would like to see an adaptation of the many deaths of Edgar Allan Poe.
I think it's like a Rashomon style. Yeah, a Rashomon style movie where there's just like several different people recounting it, but you see an adaptation of each of them.
Edge of Tomorrow type of thing. So I think we should start with our first,
Edgar Allan Poe experience.
Yes.
Yeah, our early forays.
Experienced?
Are you experienced? So let me ask you.
Like when we first encountered
have you ever been
Poe
experienced
in an alley?
Yeah, in a darkened alley.
Mm-hmm.
Why
don't you start?
I can't. I need you to start. I need you to start this one. I'm not ready.
Talking.
I want you to go. I'm ready. Go.
Wait, are you ready to go?
I'm ready for you to go. I'm going to stop.
God. Stop
now.
talking.
Understood.
Starting now. So my first Edgar Allan Poe experience was in high school. We were assigned, I believe it was in Mr. Snap's class, I want to say.
Wow. Shout out to Mr. Snap.
Yeah, Mr. Snap. I believe we read The Telltale Heart.
Nice.
I don't believe. I know that's what we did. I don't know if it was Mr. Snap or someone else, but let's pretend. Let's just say it was Mr. Snap that told us to read A Telltale Heart.
Edgar Allan Snap.
Snap, Crackle, and Poe. That was a good one. You know it. So, yeah, I read The Telltale Heart, and if for anybody that's read that, you know what a sort of life-changing experience anyone who loves literature.
Shit, yes.
I grew up knowing and reading and having my dad read me Aesop's Fables. So I feel like it's like Aesop's Fables, except horror versions of real people not so much animals, like it's like moral tales.
Telltale Heart for sure is a moralistic tale.
Yeah, making choices.
Yeah.
And so I just found it to be fascinating. And also it made me think of an author having this type of imagination and brain that I hadn't encountered yet.
Well, as you mentioned reading it in school, and same. That was also my earliest experience. I came from a devoutly religious family. So Poe was not introduced in the home. It was introduced in school. And my first introduction was similar to yours in that it blew my mind out the back of my little head and changed my life forever. Yeah. And I like to think, obviously that doesn't happen to everybody. There are, I'd say the majority of students in any high school class are probably like, fuck this.
Or maybe didn't read it.
Or didn't read it or didn't get around to it.
Or just read it to get it over with.
But it was a bolt of lightning moment for me. And our first reading was The Raven, which I argue, I'm so glad we continued a whole section on Poe because we read The Telltale Heart, we read The Cask of Amontillado, and those two are what like really solidified Poe for me. Because The Raven is something that I don't think you can really appreciate as like a 7th grader. It's a story about, being trapped in a psychological prison of your own design as the result of a lifetime of tragedy and poor decision making. You just don't have like the experiential wherewithal. I remember reading that in the 7th grade and being like, what? And then reading it later in as an adult and having a much more profound experience with it because I had more to compare it to.
So back to me, after I read A Telltale Heart for school, I perused my dad's library and he actually had a leather-bound, very classic copy of the complete Tales and Poems of Edgar Allan Poe. So
lucky.
I started to go through and read some of them on my own time.
Shout out to longtime non-listener, Laura's dad.
Well, he listens sporadically, I think.
Hey, you know what? As long as the downloads are constant,
yeah, exactly.
The listens can be sporadic.
Subscribed.
Yeah, just honestly, just download them.
Yeah, and they're the sewn pages, and it's got the satin ribbon page marker.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Especially when you're a kid, it makes you feel like you're reading a forbidden tome.
Yeah. So I started to read that, and what I discovered next was Cask of Amontillado.
And if that one doesn't do it for you, you're not going to like Poe.
You're not going to be a Poe.
Yeah. Perfect.
Thank you.
Yes. Not to unnecessarily gender anyone, but his female fans do like to self-refer as poets.
So that's really where I started to discover, and then I wanted to read more horror.
Yeah. Oh, so this was not only a gateway to Poe, but it was a gateway to
honestly, Mr.
macabre.
Snap's class. Just to give another shout out to Mr. Snap, his class is what really got me into horror reading of horror because I read this short story in his class called Bloodsport, and it was very similar to The Most Dangerous Game, that vibe.
I'm assuming this is the novelization of the Jean-Claude Van Damme movie,
No.
Bloodsport. I didn't know they turned it into a book. That's amazing.
Bloodspot, I think.
So I know The Most Dangerous Game.
Yeah.
And that's been adapted a billion times. I think Jake Johnson just made a movie that's kind of similar to The Most Dangerous Game in a way.
Not really.
Anything with human prey being hunted by billionaires, that's The Most Dangerous Game.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, he was less hunted than it was about him.
Yeah.
So
like what Elon Musk does on the weekends.
Maybe it was Bloodstain.
It was Blood something. Yeah.
Anyway, that was.
Now I just can't wait to read.
And then
Bloodsport.
I started going to the library, as I've already talked about way back in our initial episode. I started to pick up, Michael Balducci and Stephen King and Truman Capote. So
hello, Truman Capote. That's
Wow.
spot on. So the cool thing about Poe for me, growing up in a largely restrictive environment, is for the, I'm not going to say uneducated, but let's just say surface educated. Edgar Allan Poe, you can get away with it because despite the fact that it's gory, graphic, and horror, it's old and Victorian. So you just go, oh, it's classic literature, and boom, that's how I was able to read all of his work in a house where that kind of shit was not allowed.
Yeah.
Yep, you just go, it's old.
Or it's a school assignment.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, that is very similar to me in that after reading Cask of Amontillado especially, and that to this day, I just recently reread it, is still maybe the scariest story I've ever read in my life. It induces a somatic effect in me that when I am reading that book, my heart starts to race. My palms get sweaty. I have a physical reaction to that story, despite the fact that it is over a century old, and I have read it a baker's dozen times over the course of my life. It just the unbelievably callous, methodical method of that story. You know what? I'm sorry. I'm getting sidetracked. We are going to get deeper into the stories. We're talking about personal experiences. So I did the same thing, Laura. My parents didn't have a big old copy of Edgar Allan Poe, although to their credit, they did have the complete works of Robert Frost, so it's not like they were illiterate. It just that, they didn't have like nasty stuff. So I went to the library, the Oyster Bay East Norwich Public Library, which was also one of my early jobs, working in the library. Shout out, love you all so much, librarians. And just burning a hole in my library card.
Absolutely.
Reading everything I could. The Pit and the Pendulum, the Gold Bug, it's a really long title that Arthur Gordon Pym, Arthur Gordon Pym, the strange narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. Anyway, Murders at the Rue Morgue, all this stuff.
The Black Cat.
Yes. And then I'm going to get into this a little bit later, his poetry.
Yeah. I'm very excited to dive into his dark works. We're not going to talk about his non-horror works on this podcast. But
no, because
we may recommend some towards the end of non-horror Poe that we really like.
That's for our sister podcast, Normal Stuff in Tandem, which is, just very, very safe.
So let's get into the man.
The man himself. He was a totally normal, well-adjusted guy who made friends easily, kept them for life.
Not his fault. Let's
definitely
start
didn't make
way back
enemies.
at the beginning. He was born in Boston in 1809.
Yeah, he's the original B2B.
Right around now, actually, January 19th.
Yes.
So
coming up, Poes and Poettes.
You may be listening to this episode on a January of 19th.
Happy birthday.
And I'm sure there's so many celebrations out there
for
Poe on his birthday.
He really loved to go to Dunkin' to get a crulla. So they make a big deal there.
I thought he liked the blueberry cake.
He went to Fenway a lot.
Anyway, he died in October of 1849 in Baltimore. And dummy co-host of Richard, I'm the dummy. I didn't know that the Baltimore Ravens were named after Edgar Allan Poe.
And me, who barely knows what a football looks like, did know that.
Yeah. So anyway, he was the son of an English actress named Elizabeth Arnold Poe and an actor named David Poe Jr. His mom died when he was 2, and then his dad abandoned him.
Yeah.
Just totally pieced out and took off and gave him to a rich merchant living in Virginia named John Allen and his wife.
Hence his taking on the name
Allen.
Edgar Allan Poe.
Correct.
It used to just be Eddie Poe.
So he then went to Scotland and England between age 6 and 12 to get an education. He did then later attend the University of Virginia, but for less than a year because he gambled so much that he was not allowed to continue.
I mean, we've all been there, right? You get to college, you hit the casinos, suddenly you're strapped.
He then returned to Richmond and became engaged to, I would argue that is the love of his life.
It is.
Sarah Elmira Royster.
Oh, actually, I would argue
Nope.
Oh, interesting.
Because she later is widowed and he then returns and re-engages with her.
Yeah,
but she soon dies later. So I would argue that this is the love of his life.
Okay, not his
married,
his eventual
his wife cousin, his cousin wife,
his Giuliani marriage.
I believe was the true love of his life.
Interesting. Okay, yeah.
Her family was vehemently opposed to their match.
Opposed,
mostly because he had no money and he was sort of I don't know. A mess. He was a little bit.
I
of a
want
mess.
to be so. I understand. I know what you're saying. In reading about his history, I think it's very easy, especially when you read something like history, which is just such a condensing of someone's life, cutting out so much. It's kind of easy to read him as a failure to launch type.
He didn't have direction.
He struggled to find his place. Is the way that I like to think of it. He struggled to find his
place in the early 1800s because everybody was going into, I would say, like a proper business, like a business person,
a respectable business, like the slave trade, which his adopted father was into.
Correct. Yes, very much. And I would say he treated Edgar Allan Poe almost like a piece of property.
It was a very complicated relationship in that he never let his son fall all the way to the bottom. And he did financially support his writing to a degree, but he treated him like shit.
Yeah, so poverty after he never ended up executing this marriage with Sarah Elmira Royster. Poverty forced him to join the army, and he enlisted under the name Edgar A. Perry.
Yes. Lied about his age. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
His foster mother died, and then John Allen purchased his release from the army and sent him to West Point to try to get him some discipline and get him set straight. He published a pamphlet called Tamerlane.
Yes.
And other poems.
Yes. And I believe that original publication was partially financed by his fellow army mates.
Yes.
Who, as the story goes, gave up the money because they were, whether or not Edgar Allan Poe led them to this conclusion or they came to it on their own, under the impression the poems would be about them and their unit. Mm-hmm. And they were not. Yeah. Anyone who's read Tamerlane knows it's not about an army barracks in the 19th century.
Yeah, exactly. So they thought the other poems might have been about them, but it wasn't.
Hey, there's none about Corporal Fred.
He was later expelled from West Point and moved to New York City to write short stories. Then he moved to Baltimore, and this is about 1833. He found in a bottle, won $50 from a weekly publication when he was in Baltimore. And 2 years later, he became the editor of the Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond.
Now, that's the thing, Laura, is a lot of readers, and I when I learned about this when I was younger, I certainly didn't appreciate it. We know Poe almost exclusively through his horror writing and a bit through his poetry. But in his lifetime, he was quite well known and primarily known as a literary critic.
Yes, and a bad one. A hatchet.
An incendiary, caustic, kind of tabloid style critic where his modus operandi, and I think there have over the years been some armchair psychiatry, which I'm not a fan of, but people pointing out behavioral quirks of Poe's as being reminiscent of someone on the spectrum. I don't know about all that, but as a critic, he certainly didn't use the pen to make himself any fucking friends.
No, but he did befriend and marry someone right around this time.
Yes.
His 13-year-old cousin.
He was 26.
27.
Ah.
But close enough.
See, 26 would have been fine. 27, though? That's gross.
Yeah. 13-year-old cousin Virginia Clem. He
True love.
Now let go of this editing job due to his drinking.
Not due to marrying a 13-year-old.
Nope.
Which,
because that was fine back then.
honestly, depending on where you are in the country, I feel like it's fine now. To some people.
He was let go because of his drinking, but he was rarely intoxicated at work.
Rarely.
It only seemed that he was found to be publicly intoxicated when he was in public.
Well, that's usually where they find you to be publicly intoxicated.
in public.
Yeah. No, listen, like I said, the man made a lot of enemies with his work. And when you do that, your habits get nitpicked.
So I'm sure Virginia was like, listen, I'm a teenager. I need, the best in all of the writing papers to keep in touch with all of my friends. Can you get a job?
Yeah.
And
That's
he got
word for word from her diary.
He got hired to edit the Burton's Gentleman's Magazine in 1839 in Philadelphia, where he wrote the story collection, The Fall of the House of Usher.
Yes.
So he published the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, like right before that.
His one and only novel.
Which was considered the inspiration for Moby Dick.
It's been considered the inspiration for a lot of things. H.P. Lovecraft quite openly said it was his inspiration to write his masterpiece At the Mountains of Madness. Because I think it greatly influenced Edgar Rice Burroughs in his Conan the Barbarian writings. That between that and Ultima Thule, it's the story of a man traveling and seeing things beyond human imagining, and mysteries and ancient secrets and societies. And it's not quite horror, but it definitely kickstarted the incredibly popular pulp genre. I mean, Poe created like 2 or 3 literary genres on his own.
Let's back up a little bit. Moby Dick came out in 1851. So it's when I say that it was thought to be the inspiration for Moby Dick, that is similar timing of when that novel came out, just like a decade later.
Yeah.
What you're talking about with Lovecraft, that didn't come out until like 100 years later. So I'm sure he can draw
70,
that inspiration,
later,
but
maybe.
I thought it was really interesting because Moby Dick isn't really a horror. I mean, I guess it's
can be a horror to get through.
Agree to disagree.
Weren't you the one saying, oh, no, that was a friend.
Yeah.
Who took umbrage with the 400 pages on
audience. I guess I've just been
told
that I am not a friend.
No, you're my nemesis.
So then shortly after some of this work started to be more successful, Murders in the Rue Morgue came out. And that is the birth of the modern detective story.
With C. Auguste Dupin.
Exactly. And yes, so this was really something different that nobody had done it before. Nope. I said it's the birth of the modern detective.
He predates Sherlock Holmes. He predates Hercule Poirot.
If I said Edgar Allan Poe to you, would you say, oh yeah, the creator of the modern detective story? No, you would not.
Oh, I might.
But I want you to say it now with me.
Just
say his
run
name.
to your windows. Say
Edgar
I'm as mad as hell.
Allan Poe is the
creator of the detective novel.
I said to say it with me.
Oh, sorry.
We're going to go take a break so I can slap some sense into my co-host.
We're going to workshop our choreography. Well, this is embarrassing. All that preparation and research, not to mention the thousands of hours spent on tinkering and fine-tuning your ironic death traps. And now you've just blown 3 years of work because in the midst of your murderous pedantry, You forgot to grease the traps. Now a very confused recovering addict you welded to a dentist chair is wondering why her head is still attached and you have to just shoot them like some kind of amateur. Sound familiar? I know it does to me, which is why I went ahead and invented a new formula of lesson-giving death machine lubricant I call Jigsaw's Trap Grease. Every barrel of Jigsaw's Trap Grease contains enough lubricant to ensure your Rube Goldberg nightmare creations flow as smoothly as arterial blood. Snap off heads, slowly pull people into buzzsaws, or smush them all with giant blocks of ice or something. Whatever lesson you think these people need to learn through agonizing death, Jigsaw's Trap Grease will make sure it all goes down without so much as a creak. Call now and ask about our special voice modulators. Because it's only scary if you sound like a 75-year-old chain smoker. This is a fake ad for a fake product on a horror-themed podcast. We do not condone nor endorse using torture and death as a pedagogical method. That's what parochial schools are for. Ooh, welcome back.
So what we were talking about, modern detective novels and stories, but he was still destitute and impoverished. He never really had the dollars rolling in. He did eventually win some money for the Gold Bug, and then The Raven came out in American Review in the mid-1840s. And it gave him national fame. So he was always known sort of in these smaller literary circles, and also definitely by other authors because of how brutal he was as a critic.
That's the thing that it's hard to suss out, because The Raven was critically thrashed when it came out by a lot of incredible authors, both when it came out and later. I mean, much, much, much later, T.S. Eliot lambasted The Raven as basically being about nothing, which is all respect to you, Mr. Eliot.
Yes.
You're right. It is about it's about limbo. It's kind of supposed to be about nothing. But anyway, I think Wadsworth Longfellow at the time, who was someone that Poe went after pretty heavily in his criticism, was very critical of The Raven. Thoreau was very critical of The Raven. A lot of popular and famous authors at the time who also Poe had insulted publicly came out and said, this is a piece of shit.
Well, when he did a reading in Boston, he basically talked about how much of a hilarious, disgusting attempt at a literary city Boston was. So everybody in the audience being from Boston, he was insulting them while doing a reading, and it was very scandalous.
That is awesome. I mean,
because he was undermining his own success.
Boston, famously known as maybe one of the most literary cities in America.
Yeah. Clear abandonment issues. I mean,
well,
he's got obvious abandonment issues. His dad abandoned him, and so he's like, I'm coming close to success, so I'm going to ruin it.
I'm saying this man could not make a friend to save his fucking life.
In spite of himself, he still was considered on the peak, on the cusp of success here.
He, by all accounts, in reading about him, is someone that is a hero I never want to meet.
Right.
And he seems absolutely insufferable.
He had some, time of The Raven being a success, but definitely being talked about and not a success by other standards. And then a few years later, his wife died of tuberculosis.
Yes.
And
they were married for 11 years.
Yeah, her death, and she was actually 11 when she died. Just kidding.
No, I mean, by the time she died, it was a relatively normal age gap.
Her death sent him into madness.
Oh, that was it for him.
The darkest depression.
Yeah, he never recovered.
He wrote a letter to a friend saying that Virginia's constant vacillations between recovery and relapse had driven him insane.
I can understand that. Yeah, the hope only to be dashed, that they say that's true hell, is the introduction of a spark of hope, is what hell cannot be pure torment. It has to have hope in it to be actual torment.
Yeah. He started to take on some lovers and friends, female friends, of which he wrote many poetic tributes over the next couple of years.
Well, before we get on to that, I would like to say Virginia's death was the inspiration for one of my favorite poems by Edgar Allan Poe, which is Annabel Lee.
Yes.
Which is about two young lovers that the world is jealous.
He's giving himself a little.
Yeah, credit. I know. Two young lovers that the world is jealous of, but not just the world. The gods themselves are jealous of them because their love is so perfect that they kill her, and it's just this man sitting alone by her grave.
Yeah, that came out after he was taking on some lovers to get past this point.
Yeah.
And he said that then his inspiration started to come from his own fever dreams.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
Blended with romanticism and the occult.
I think that's where you get the black cat.
Absolutely.
And some of his more stories focused on madness.
Correct. And he was reportedly ill when he moved back to Baltimore in 1849. And there was supposedly a very corrupt local election that was happening. And then he mysteriously disappeared for 5 days. And when he reappeared, he was mad and wearing someone else's clothes.
Wandering the streets of Baltimore, muttering.
Yes. And then it took him another almost week to sort of come back to reality. And then he died soon after. So
and his last words,
after repeatedly calling out the name Reynolds over and over again,
were "Lord help my poor soul." Yikes. Yeah. That is heartbreaking.
That's someone who knows they're going to pass away.
And someone who is afraid to. And yeah, he was a troubled man, but there is a lot of mystery and conspiracy surrounding his admittedly bizarre death.
Yeah, there's lots of books and stories written about, the 7 deaths of Edgar Allan Poe.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the reality, and then I want to talk about one of the major reasons why there's so much confusion around his death.
Yeah.
Because now the official cause of death that was listed was inflammation of the brain.
Yeah.
Which I don't know if that's like encephalitis, something like that.
It probably wasn't called encephalitis at the time.
Lord knows where he even was during that 5 days. Why was he wearing someone's clothes?
Well, I'll tell you where he was and why he was doing this.
Let's hear it.
When he was in Richmond, he rekindled his romance with the aforementioned Sarah Elmira Royster, now Shelton, who was a wealthy widow. And even though her children did not want them to be together, they got engaged. He was going to move to Richmond, but she died.
Oh.
So after she died, he basically got on a ship and went to Baltimore. So he was there similarly to losing his cousin wife.
Yeah.
Just probably completely depressed and
out of his mind, drunk.
So on October 3rd, which was an election day, Poe was found delirious in a tavern called the Gunners Hall in Baltimore. Like I said, that's where he was found after so many days, not knowing where he was. A few days later, on October 7th, like you said, inflammation of the brain, which is called pharyngitis, actually, I guess. That's supposedly always the true cause, but there has been 26 published theories.
Good Lord.
On his death.
Now, one of the more interesting ones to me is you had mentioned the contested election, the contentious election at the time. There was a group of thugs that would go through the city kidnapping people and threatening them into voting for their candidate. And one of the theories is they kidnapped Poe, went a little too far on this guy that was already, completely out of his mind.
Yeah, sometimes maybe he just got caught in the shuffle of being beat upon,
Yeah,
too.
I think being drunk, getting your ass beat, and then wandering the streets, alone, it's a combination of things. But that's one prevailing theory, is that he was accosted by poll watchers. Does that sound familiar?
One implied theory was the author of Mystery Death of Edgar Allan Poe by Joseph Snodgrass. So Snodgrass was an advocate for temperance. And
Jesus,
he basically blamed Poe's death on excessive alcohol consumption. And he would go and speak publicly about it, use him as an example, and always find a way to blame Poe's death on alcohol in some way.
How very Christian of him. Wonderful. I want to talk briefly about Poe's primary nemesis and maybe the most petty asshole to have ever fucking walked the earth. And that is a man with the perfect name of Rufus Wilmot Griswold. If you are going to have a literary nemesis, his name had better be Rufus Wilmot Griswold. So Rufus Wilmot Griswold, and yes, I will be referring to him
By his
properly. Basically, he was another writer and editor, and initially he and Poe were friendly. They hit it off. Poe was included in an anthology of poems published and edited by Griswold. That's Rufus Wilmot Griswold. And almost immediately after, Poe wrote an essay and published it questioning why certain other poets were allowed to publish their works alongside his, which is classic Poe friend making. So Griswold basically developed a lifelong hatred of Poe. And lifelong actually doesn't cover it, because most of what Griswold did to Poe happened after his death. So they tried to reconcile. I think Poe tried to reconcile a couple of times with him. Didn't quite work, because I imagine those apologies went about as well as anything Poe tried to say to people. So Griswold, after Poe died, under the pen name Ludwig, wrote an incendiary...
Ludwig van Griswold?
No, just Ludwig. Wrote and published in the papers an incendiary and very fake obituary about Poe, with one of the lines being something like, Edgar Allan Poe has passed from this world and no one will miss him. It's like the way it started. And he went on to write a biography of Poe, a fake biography, which accused him of plagiarism and all these other things. And it took decades for people to suss out what was true and what wasn't about Poe, because he had made so many enemies that after his death slandered him and told lies and told stories. And you mentioned this one crazy preacher
He was a
going
magazine
around.
editor.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
there were
Snodgrass.
people going around giving these kinds of polemics using
He
Edgar
actually
Allan Poe.
helped him at one point to get help for his alcoholism.
Yeah, I think
Snodgrass.
Edgar Allan Poe bit every single hand that ever fed him. But I am blown away by the fact that not even this man's death could stop his enemies from, they were like, no, dying's not enough. I need to ruin your name for all time. I'm going to make sure, I'm going to salt the earth. Well, sorry, Rufus Wilmot Griswold. It didn't fucking work. I'm sorry Poe was a jerk to you, but we're reading him and not original Griswolds. So.
Yeah. And so you talked about his last words.
Lord help my
Somebody
poor
had
soul.
to have heard those. And that was so John Joseph Moran was Poe's attending physician, and he's the one that really talked about his, how he appeared.
Not well,
and also reported on his last words. He said also that, the name Reynolds, which is my segue here to talk about Jeremiah N. Reynolds, which was a newspaper editor and explorer who might have inspired the novel, the narrative of Arthur Pym of Nantucket.
Oh, that's
some people
awesome.
think that might have been someone coming to get some money from him.
What's more 1850s than a newspaper editor / adventurer?
There was also someone named Henry R. Reynolds, which was one of the judges overseeing the Fourth Ward polls at Ryan's Tavern, which is where he was sort of found last.
The polls?
Alive.
Yeah.
Who they think Poe might have met on Election Day. And they're not really sure about that. But one of the other pieces to the whole political side of things is there is a person named Mark Dowdy-Zayak. I don't know. Mark D, let's call him. Said that
Mike D?
Mark.
Oh.
He thinks that Poe got involved in the practice of cooping. So cooping is a common practice of the time that was an act of rounding up vagrants and other powerless and unassuming men.
Yes, yeah.
Trapping them in a confined space and sending them out to various polling places under false names in order to cast fraudulent votes.
Yes.
So they think that he might have gotten swept up in that, or this person thinks that, and that mental and physical abuses came as a result of getting caught.
I think
any of these
the
could
most
be plausible.
likely explanation is this was a broken man who was friendless, had no one looking out for him, was wandering the streets for days and days.
Probably was fevered and sick
Yeah,
somewhere.
probably sick, running a fever, drunk, and drinking more, smoking, getting the shit beat out of him.
Cholera, could have been tuberculosis, which is
the whole
what his
change of
wife
clothes
died
things.
of.
Could be, who knows what kind of weird odyssey of a bender he went on in the last week of his life. But I think it's most likely just the case of a broken man at the end of his rope,
undiagnosed mental illness,
dying of alcohol
grieving,
consumption and exposure.
And grieving.
Yeah.
And also being kind of a shit.
Yeah.
So maybe he was a drunk
But
shit
I've always
to the
felt,
wrong person.
I've always felt for Poe a little bit because in reading his writing, he is a snob and he is a gatekeeper, but there's a genuine, he's also brilliant. There is a genuine
sense. His mom
sense.
died and he was abandoned by his dad at age 2.
His brother
there really
died.
isn't a better way forward.
His brother died. Both loves of his life died. He experienced a ton of tragedy. I mean, the man died when he was 42 years old.
And they died once he was in their life. His cousin died. Yeah, they were married for 11 or 12 years. But then when he went back to re-engage with Sarah, a year or so later, she died. Or not much longer, she died.
I said he died at 42. He actually died at 40. Okay, so I'm older than Poe. But this is a man who experienced a lot of tragedy, accomplished quite a bit, despite the fact that we talked about him having... I mean, imagine describing someone as struggling to find their way, and we're describing one of the most successful, and maybe not during his lifetime, but in terms of legacy, authors of all time. Not to mention authors, a horror author.
And this was all, these works were, published. These works that we now have and read, they haven't been changed.
I think Poe could have really benefited from a friend who with a lot of patience. But I would like to sort of wrap up our intro to Poe, because we've given you a lot of history and a little bit of insight into why we read him. But I want to talk briefly about, why are we still talking about Poe? It's 160 years later. Why are we still fascinated by the works of this man who he's not the greatest writer in the world. I'm going to throw it out there. He's an amazing writer, but he's not F. Scott Fitzgerald. He's not on that level. He's not Faulkner.
This isn't going to be a literary deep dive into, expert poetic form or
critical theory.
This is, how scary is this?
That's what
How crazy and weird is this?
I think the reason why Poe has maintained such longevity is because not only is there the novelty of him being the first to do a lot of these things so successfully, but the fears he taps into, the settings may be specific, but the fears themselves are extremely universal and very accessible. The Cask of Amontillado is claustrophobia. The Pit in the Pendulum is, knowing is inevitability. The Telltale Heart is a guilty conscience. The Raven is loneliness and self-imprisonment, the prisons that we build in our minds. These are all jumping off points for anyone in the timeline of human history. They are universal themes, regardless of background, class, gender, race. We're all afraid of being alone, of being confined, of being buried alive, which is another one of his wonderful stories, and was a genuine fear of his, quite common at the time in Victorian times, being buried alive. There was a whole side market of accessories to put in the grave, like bells you could ring just in case you did get buried alive.
Yeah, right.
Capitalism always fills the gap.
I mean, who was there to listen?
Don't train better morticians. Just create a side market where you've got casket bells for people. But that's one of the reasons what I think.
Bells.
Why do you think we're still, after all these years, not just talking about Poe, but listing him at the top of our list?
Because it's the imagination. Nobody has really come close to that. I mean, like I said, it sort of brings those morality tales along with good storytelling. And at his essence, he's a great storyteller.
Yes.
It's a scary campfire story. It's this dark twist at the end. M. Night Shyamalan is forever trying to chase the
Poe dragon?
Yeah. Well, now it's his original twisted Sixth Sense twist. He's forever the twist. It's the twist people like, and there's no better person than at the twist than Edgar Allan Poe.
No, that's a really good point. It's definitely, but it's something beyond, because there are a lot of imaginative writers. I think it's the fact that what he's writing about are things that scare all of us on a fairly regular basis. We all have fears around our identity, around belonging, and these are kind of basic things to be upset about. But it is the strength of his writing, and the fact that he never overstays his welcome. These are short stories. These are quick bites. Cask of Amontillado especially is very short. But there's never too much chance to slow the pacing down. Because of the brevity of a lot of his stories, it maintains a pretty quick pace and a high sense of tension throughout, because it's only going on for 10 to 15 pages. I think it's a testament to his skill that is rarely at the detriment of character. You still get a really good sense of Roderick Usher in The Fall of the House of Usher.
Absolutely.
Despite the fact that he's not in it that much.
Yeah, these are I would say micro fiction.
Yeah, some of them definitely are. But it's the universality, and also the fact that his writing is not hard to read. His poetry is a bit more flowery and a bit more, I think, look at me and how educated I am. But his writing is not inaccessible. It's not, I wouldn't say it's workman level like Hemingway, but it's not hard to read. It's not like trying to read Mary Shelley.
And I would also say that
difficult.
We've been on, very well educated since our earliest readings of Poe, and maybe we haven't revisited, at least I can claim for myself, I haven't revisited all of the tales that we'll be talking about. So as we build the next few episodes and reread some of the classic horror tales from Poe, we're going to come to you correct. We're going to give you our insight as what we thought when we first read it, if it does vastly differentiate from how we're reading it now, and maybe some problem areas.
I'm interested in that as well.
Kind for the sake of kindness.
I want to see how much, because tastes change, certainly, and I want to see how much mythologizing I've done in my own mind of Poe versus how do I feel about it today. But I'm doing something a little different is since I've read these so many times, I found a collection of Christopher Lee reading Poe stories. Nice. So I'm going to listen to the late great Sir Christopher Lee reading some of the classics, and I can't imagine a better way to experience that. There's also, I think there's some Vincent Price reading it too that I might try to look for. But I'm going to have scary men read my stories to me.
Nice.
Which is how I prefer to read all my stories.
Well, we're going to do the retelling. We're not going to have anybody scary come and do it for us.
Okay. That was just a little bit on the man, the myth, the reality, and some of the mystery behind his life. But our next installment, we're actually going to be getting into the work itself. So that's it for Poe. Now, we don't care about the guy. We're going to be talking about the work. Well,
we'll still talk about the guy. I think we're probably going to add some color commentary at what was happening in his life, possibly during when he was writing these things.
But as pertains to the work.
Correct.
We're interested in the stories. We're going to be doing the stories, and we're going to keep listening. We'll do a little bit of the poetry, just a little bit of poetry.
Richard will. I'm not going to do any of it.
Please, you got to give me a little.
So we hope that you're excited about this next deep dive series, and we will see you next time for our regular scheduled programming. Terror in Tandem is written, produced, and recorded by Laura and Richard Mathiasen, and edited and mixed by Richard Mathiasen. Our theme was written and performed by Carrie Denver, and all other music was written and performed by David Hispanic. All opinions expressed on this podcast are our own and should be taken as such. Thanks for listening, and please remember to give us a like, a review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.